There's been times in my life where Christians, I faced it, other Christians have faced this idea of whether or not they're going to, work on the Lord's Day or whatever, and they want to try to get that off. And sometimes I've found bosses willing to work if they said, you know what, by the way this individual works all the other days of the week, it's worth it to me to keep them in my employment, even though they may not work on that particular Sunday. Just because of the money I make off of that individual, because of the way they labor so intensely and the way in which they serve me so effectively. That's the way Daniel was. Well, these princes and these presidents could not find anything against him other than his religious area. They would not be deterred, however. And as they searched for ways in which they could bring Daniel into disrepute before the king, they knew that the only way was to find some fault with his religious law. In order for this to be the case in Daniel's life or in our life, though, two things must be required. It requires a diligent and devoted lifestyle that seeks to always walk uprightly before men, whether those individuals are the children of God or not, knowing that our outward testimony is vital to the reputation of God and the faith that we profess. Although it may not be expressly stated here, it is obvious that Daniel had the idea that the way in which I serve this heathen king is actually a testimony of what I think about God. And so for us to be in a situation like Daniel's, we have to have the same mindset. But secondly, for us to be in a situation similar to Daniel's, it requires a serious devotion to our walk with God and the fulfilling of our spiritual exercises. Only through an exemplary spiritual deportment could we ever hope to find ourselves possessing a similar opportunity to that of Daniel's. You might say, well, I wouldn't want to be found in Daniel's situation. It really is a great opportunity. And as you read the book of Daniel, you realize it was a great opportunity to bring glory and honor unto God. And it even brought Daniel great fame as well. Well, Daniel's dilemma is this, and it certainly wouldn't surprise me to think that there were other areas in Daniel's spiritual life they could find, but I do find it interesting that they seek to target Daniel's commitment to God through prayer. Let's read chapter 6. Let's read verses 6 through 9. It says, Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish a decree and sign the writing that it be not changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. These men decide to place Daniel in a situation in which they feel confident concerning the outcome. They go to Darius, and playing upon his ego and pride as the king, they convince him to establish a royal statute that no individual within his kingdom would be allowed to make any petition to a god or to a man except to him as the king. A violation of the decree would result in the death of that person being cast into the lion's den to be consumed. Darius, who appears to be a friend of Daniel, was really unaware of how this would impact Daniel's life, but his own ego enabled him to sign this decree, and the stage was set for Daniel's demise. Now, we'll perhaps touch more upon this later, but if our enemies were to devise such an attack against you or I concerning our spiritual devotion, would they have any hope of success? Let's take it in this particular instance. If the way for our enemies to bring us down was to find some way in which they could twist our prayer life into bringing us into a situation where they could end our lives, could they be successful in that? Is our prayer life consistent enough? They would be able to use that against us as a means of bringing us into disrepute before the king or whatever authority. It is quite a thought, isn't it, when you think of it that way? This is the way they figured out how they could get Daniel out of the scene. Well, what is Daniel's response to this? Well, it's in our text this morning, verses 10 and 11. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem. He kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. Key phrase here, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. The question really this morning is, in light of what's happening here, what else could Daniel do? If he's going to remain consistent, there really is nothing he can do. And our text here is not a case of Daniel doing something in violation of the king's order so that he might take his stand, although I'm not trying to belittle taking our stand. We do need to at times. It's not Daniel trying to flaunt his religion. That's not what's happening here either. Daniel is facing a challenge to his normal spiritual devotion. That key phrase there at the end of verse 10, as he did aforetime, is very important. This isn't a situation where Daniel finds out the decree and says, well, I'll teach them. I'll go and pray anyway, when he hadn't been praying before. It was just Daniel being challenged with his normal practice. And for him now to stop his normal routine or to change his practice to avoid persecution would be, honestly, for Daniel, placing the fear of men before the fear of God. For Daniel, if he were to turn away now, would be saying, you know what, God really isn't all that important. It's more important for me to placate the king for these 30 days than to continue to honor the Lord in my life as I have been so effectively in the past. So we are informed in verse 10 that he went up into his house, his windows being open, in his chamber toward Jerusalem, kneeling down upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before God as he did aforetime. Now, the point of my message is not to see how this all transpired. Most of us know the story, but it is really a wonderful testimony of God's sovereign power. Because as Daniel does this, the presidents, which we had hoped, run to the king and say, this is what Daniel's done. The king, because it was an unalterable law of the Medes and Persians, could do nothing about it. Even though he didn't want to, he had to take Daniel and throw him in the lion's den as the law prescribed. But for an entire night, as Daniel was in the lion's den, God shut the mouths of the lions, and they brought no harm unto Daniel. And in the morning, as the king flees to find what has happened to Daniel and cries out to him, Daniel says, I'm safe, everything's okay. God has shut the mouth of the lions. And they haul Daniel out, and the king then takes the other presidents and throws them in. And when he throws them in, the lions consume them the way they had hoped they might consume Daniel. So it is a wonderful testimony of God's sovereign power and grace. But what was Daniel's practice of prayer? That's my point in bringing this passage up this morning. We have a very simple testimony concerning Daniel's actions, but I think they speak volumes concerning Daniel's actual practice as it relates to prayer. I believe if we were to emulate Daniel's practice, that we too could experience a marked improvement in our prayers throughout this new year. I want to draw our attention to 4 things related to Daniel's prayer that is described for us here, and I'm going to summarize them with 4 words. Firstly, this morning, I would just draw our attention to the place. The place. It says here, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house and prayed. Now certainly, there is no place where we cannot pray and pray effectively. God is everywhere, and he hears in all places. But we can almost certainly say that without a definite place in which to pray, we will not find ourselves very consistent in our prayer lives. That's probably just based upon the fact that we are such creatures of habit. Pointing out Daniel's entering into his house to pray is not to insinuate that our houses are the best place for us to pray. For some it may not be. For others there may be a better place. For me personally, praying in my house is a constant struggle. It just really is. There are too many distractions for me in my house, with 7 people occupying that house, for me really to have an effective prayer life there. It doesn't afford me the privacy that I like in my prayer time. But for other individuals, their house may be the perfect place for them to pray. Having, maybe we could say it this way, a special place of prayer affords us several things. As already stated, it provides that consistent environment that is needed to make prayer a habitual practice in our lives. Folks, if there's this place where, not that you don't pray at other times, in other places, but if there's this one place that unless, providence draws you away from it, you say, this is the place I meet with God. And it's consistent. It can build up a habitual practice of prayer in your life that can be so effective for you. I found it in my own life, and I'm sure you have as well. When my routine gets messed up, vacations, something else happens, it is a struggle for me to remain consistent in prayer. Is it the same for you? It's very, very difficult because I'm such a creature of habit. And having that special place is so important. It also provides a place, hopefully, if that's the kind of place we've chosen, where we can have privacy. Privacy to unburden our hearts. Privacy sometimes to quite vocally or tearfully, or even joyfully express ourselves in prayer. I don't know about you, but does your prayer life ever lead you to tears? It does me. Folks, if we're praying and in the midst of our prayers, which certainly is going to be a part of it, true confession is going to be involved. If at all possible, we need a private place. A place where we can feel free to just unburden our heart before God and nobody else can hear. We can just be honest and open with God about who we truly are. It's a place where we can rejoice freely and not worry about what others are thinking. The actual place itself is not important, but our prayer place should be that special sanctuary where we go to meet with God. There have been different places for me throughout my life based upon where I've been or circumstances around us. There was a time in my life where a parking lot was my place of prayer. It was wonderful. The only problem was it wasn't rain, but you could get out with your umbrella. But it was a private parking lot. It was quiet. I could go back there and just walk up and down that parking lot. It was such a special place for me. I've used this church auditorium and other church auditoriums as well, but it gets really rough in the winter because it's awful cold up here walking around in this church auditorium. But it's usually empty. It's a quiet place to pray. I've used a basement before as my sanctuary to get with the Lord. There's been times where there was a hillside I used to walk on in my time to pray with God. My office at times becomes that sanctuary where I can pray before God. All of these places and more have been a special sanctuary where I have gone to meet with God in prayer. Do you have a special place where you pray? Jesus has described it as entering into your closet and praying. Daniel had such a place. Do you have such a place? I'm here to tell you this morning, if you're anything like me, and I really think in this regard we're all pretty much the same, if you don't have a special place to pray, you're always going to struggle. You need to have a special place. Secondly, though, I would point out the manner of his prayer. It says, in his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees and he prayed. Now, once again, I don't think there is a proper or improper manner in which to pray. Daniel is described here as kneeling to pray, but the Bible also itself clearly speaks of people standing in prayer. It speaks of lying prostrate in our prayers. Some people pray better with their eyes closed. Others pray better with their eyes open. I've had a real problem when I pray with my eyes closed of nodding off into blissful sleep and losing out on my prayer life. It doesn't work real well for me, but others, they get constantly distracted if their eyes are open. But there's a certain manner in which we pray. Some people speak out loud. Others pray silently within their heart and mind. There is no right or wrong way, but having a specific manner in which we pray can also help us be more consistent. Once again, it's not that circumstances may not dictate differently. I tend to pray out loud, but there are certain times I'm in an environment where I can't, so I pray silently. Certainly God is hearing, and my prayers are not deterred in any way, but it's just not the consistent way I like to pray, and I always feel frustrated because it's not the way in which I like to. Daniel's opening of his windows toward Jerusalem obviously created for him a mindset concerning his prayer to God. Jerusalem was the city of God. It was the place where the sanctuary had been, the place where God was depicted as dwelling among his people. And although Daniel no longer lived in Jerusalem, and although Jerusalem was no longer as it had been when it was under Jewish reign, by opening his windows, it was representing to Daniel that he's praying toward the God of Israel. And I think that was his mindset. The posture of kneeling probably helped Daniel to better conceptualize the necessary elements of humility and submission that go along with prayer. Praying Hyde, John Hyde, a man who's often talked about concerning his prayer, it is stated that he prayed in the same position, kneeling along his bedside for such an extended period of time that he actually wore grooves in the floorboards near the side of his bed. A consistent, habitual place and manner in which he prayed. While I do personally kneel at times to pray, for me, my more frequent matter of prayer is walking about. It seems to work best for me. I walk, I pray with my eyes open, I speak out loud, and I found this to be effective for me. God can and will hear our prayers regardless of our manner, but having a consistent manner of prayer can help us be more effective.